The most powerful man in Chicago was dying on his own dining room floor, and every single person in that house was doing the wrong thing. Marcus Corvino was 38 years old, a man who'd never let anyone see him lose control, and now he lay convulsing beside an overturned table, one arm still tangled in the tablecloth he'd dragged down with him. Someone shouted that it was a stroke. Someone tried to lift him. Someone ran for the private doctor. 12 armed men on the property, a security system worth 7 figures, and not one of them knew that the clock had already started, and that whatever they did in the next 4 minutes would decide whether he ever opened his eyes again. Then the maid walked in. Wren Callahan was 28. She'd cleaned that house for 6 months, and in all that time, not one person there had bothered to learn her name. She didn't scream, and she didn't freeze. She crossed the room, knelt down, put 2 fingers against his throat, and when the head of security grabbed her shoulder, put his other hand on his weapon, and told her to get back, she didn't move an inch. She looked up at a room full of men who'd spent their entire lives being feared, and she said one sentence that stopped every one of them cold. What she did in the 8 minutes after that would change everything for all of them. If stories about human dignity move you, take a second to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's get back to that dining room floor. He isn't having a stroke. His heart has stopped. She didn't raise her voice at all, and that was exactly what made the words drive themselves into every person in the room. Every man there had been trained to react to shouting, and shouting was the one thing she refused to give them. Each word came out level and certain, the way someone speaks a truth they've said many times before, and every sound in the dining room died at once. The housekeeper stood frozen with both hands covering her mouth. A man near the door still had a phone pressed to his ear, his mouth hanging slightly open. The call already connected and then somehow forgotten. Somewhere behind them, the leg of a chair scraped once across the floor and went still, as though even it had thought better of making another sound. Dean Whitaker was the first to come back to himself. He'd been in charge of security for the Corvino family for 9 years, and in all those 9 years, he had never once allowed a stranger to come within arm's reach of the man he was paid to protect. His hand clamped around Wren's shoulder, his fingers digging into the muscle. "Move." She didn't move. She let him hold her shoulder, while 2 fingers remained pressed against the side of Marcus Corvino's neck, her eyes fixed on his chest. "He's still breathing," Dean said. "Look at him. He's still breathing. That isn't breathing." She spoke without turning her head. "That's called agonal breathing. It's a reflex. It can happen for about a minute after the heart stops, and people see it and think there's still time, until that minute is gone." His other hand had already dropped toward his hip. She heard the movement more than she saw it. The small shift of a jacket hem, the sound a man makes when he's weighing a decision. "You're the housekeeper," Dean said. "Yes." "Then you stand up, step back, and let the doctor handle it." "How far away is he?" Dean didn't answer. Only then did she turn her head and look directly at him for the first time. There was no defiance on her face. Defiance was something he knew how to deal with. This was closer to impatience, the flat, utterly unimpressed look of someone who had walked through a door he'd never opened, and it unsettled him more than any argument could have. "Then let me tell you what's about to happen," she said. "Right now, there's still oxygen in his blood. It isn't moving because nothing is pushing it, but it's still there. If somebody starts moving that blood through his body within the next minute or 2, he still has a chance. After 4 minutes, brain cells start dying, and they don't grow back. After 10 minutes, there won't be any reason for anybody to drive fast anymore." She raised her free hand and folded 1 finger down. "You have 3 seconds to decide whether you'd rather be wrong about me or wrong about him. 2. 1. Dean let go of her shoulder. He would think about that moment for a long time afterward, and he would never be able to say exactly what made him do it. It wasn't that she had convinced him. She hadn't tried to convince him at all. She had given him a set of facts, and then put a clock on them. And the clock was the honest part. What happened next happened fast, and it happened because she stopped asking and started giving orders. "He's on carpet. I need him on the hardwood floor. 2 people, 1 at each shoulder, and pull him. Don't lift him, just pull. Keep his head aligned with his body." No one argued. 2 men who had spent their lives making other people shrink away dropped to their knees on the dining room floor and dragged their boss by the shoulders, the rug bunching behind his back, the heels of his shoes leaving 2 long tracks through the things that had fallen around him. The entire way, she cradled his head in her palm, then lowered it herself, flat on his back, Straight, nothing under his head. She placed the heel of one hand in the center of his chest, locked the other hand over it, then looked up. You, the one with the phone, are you connected to them yet? The man nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. Then say exactly this. Adult male, 38 years old, cardiac arrest, not breathing, CPR beginning now. Then clearly give them the Winnetka address and the gate code. And don't hang up. They'll stay on the line with you. Let them. They're asking me questions. Answer them and don't hang up. She had already turned away from him. Does this house have a defibrillator? An automated external defibrillator. A yellow or orange case, about the size of a laptop, with the letters AED on the front. Blank faces turned toward one another. Then the housekeeper, in a voice barely above a whisper, said it was mounted on the wall in the security room, right beside the door. Go. Run. Bring the whole case here. Don't open it on the way. One man was already through the doorway before she finished the sentence. And somebody get to the gate. Not the driveway. The gate. Open it now. Stand where the ambulance can see you, and wave them in. This property is large. They'll lose 30 seconds trying to find the house, and he doesn't have 30 seconds to give away to anybody. Dean was already moving toward the hallway. Wren looked down. There were people on this estate who had never once heard Marcus Corvino raise his voice, and were still afraid of him. There were people across 3 counties who wouldn't say his name in a normal tone. He was lying flat on his back on the floor of his own dining room, his collar pulled crooked to one side, his face turning gray, and none of those things meant anything to him now. She drove her shoulders down over her hands and locked her elbows. The clock in the hallway read 4 minutes past 8. She began. She pushed down, and his chest sank beneath her hands, farther than anyone watching had imagined it could. One firm compression straight into the center of his breastbone, then a full release that allowed the chest to recoil completely. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted aloud, her voice steady as a metronome, and no one in the room understood why she needed to count until they realized she was keeping herself from speeding up, from slowing down, from letting the fear filling the room seep into her hands. On the 10th compression, a dry crack came from his chest, and the housekeeper let out a strangled cry. Normal, Wren said without stopping, without looking up. Rib cartilage. I'm compressing to the right depth. If you didn't hear something like that, it could mean I'm not pressing hard enough. She kept counting. 20, 21, 22. And after every 30 compressions, she tilted his head back, lifted his chin, gave him 2 short breaths, then returned her hands to his chest. In the corner of the room, Dean Whitaker had a phone pressed to his ear, his voice dropping into the register he reserved only for people who stood above him. Dr. Preston Hale answered on the second ring. Dean described quickly and precisely what he had seen. The overturned table, the convulsions, the details people naturally reached for when describing a stroke, and then added that a woman was performing chest compressions on his boss at that very moment. The other end of the line went silent for exactly 1 beat. Tell her to stop. Hale's voice was calm and warm, the kind of voice that made a patient feel safe the moment they heard it. Dean, listen to me. What you just described was a seizure. A seizure is a neurological sign, not a cardiac one. This is most likely a stroke. And if it is, his heart is still beating. His pulse may simply be too weak for someone without medical training to find. Performing chest compressions on someone whose heart is still beating can trigger an arrhythmia. It can break ribs and drive one into a lung. It can kill him faster than whatever caused this in the first place. Don't let anyone do anything else. Keep him still. Loosen his collar, and don't let anyone touch him. I'm on my way. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Dean lowered the phone and took 2 steps toward her. Dr. Hale says stop. Wren didn't stop. 33, 34. Did you hear me? He says it could be a stroke. He says you're hurting him. He's saying that over a phone. Wren answered, never losing the rhythm. He's 20 minutes away, and he has never put his fingers on this man's neck. I have. There's no pulse, no spontaneous breathing. His pupils are dilated. This man is no longer getting blood to his brain. If I'm wrong and his heart is still beating, the worst outcome is that he breaks a few ribs and I have to answer to some review board. If he's wrong and I listen to him, this man dies on this floor while we wait 20 minutes. You choose. Dean stood there, and for the second time in less than 4 minutes, he had no answer. Wren kept counting. 42, 43. Her shoulders were beginning to burn. Something in her body remembered before her mind had time to think. The locked elbows, the way she drove her weight down from her hips instead of her arms, the habit of glancing toward a clock at the end of every cycle. There had once been nights when she had done this exact thing beneath white hospital lights, with monitors sounding beside her and another person already waiting to take over every 2 minutes. Someone calling out the time, someone administering medication, an entire team surrounding the patient. Now there was only her, a hardwood floor, and more than a dozen men who didn't know where to stand. That was the only difference, and she pushed it aside because even that did nothing for the man beneath her hands. 58, 59. By the 4th cycle, her arms had begun to tremble below the elbows, and she knew exactly what came next. The compressions would gradually become shallower, then slower, while the person giving them often failed to notice it happening. Whitaker. She said his name for the first time. Come here. Kneel on the other side of him. Dean didn't move. You weigh twice what I do, and you aren't tired. You can keep this up longer than I can. Kneel down. He knelt. Heel of your hand. Right here. Center of the breastbone. Not off to the left. Put the other hand on top. Lace your fingers together, and keep them lifted off his chest. Lock your elbows. Don't bend them. Your shoulders need to stay directly above your hands. Drive the force down from your hips, not your arms, or you'll last 40 seconds. He placed his hands on the chest of the man he had protected for 9 years, and for one moment, he couldn't make himself press down. 2 inches deep, faster than you think, about 2 compressions every second. I'll count. After every 30, you stop, and I give the breaths. When I tell you to switch, we switch. No arguing. Start. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dean pressed. The first compression was too shallow. Deeper. He pressed harder, and the chest beneath his hands sank in a way that made every instinct in him want to pull away. But she kept counting, and he held on to that count like a man gripping a rope. 12, 13, 14. She leaned back for a moment, rotating her wrists to bring the blood back into them. And just then, she heard pounding footsteps racing down the hallway, the snap of a plastic latch being released, and the man she had sent for the defibrillator burst into the room with the orange case clutched against his chest. Give it to me. Keep compressing. Don't stop. Ren snatched the orange case, flipped the latches open, and the machine's voice filled the room, a calm, pre-recorded female voice, programmed to guide people through every step when they had never done this before. And among the men standing frozen in place, that mechanical calm sounded almost cruel. She didn't listen to it. She had already peeled the backing from the first pad before the machine finished its first sentence. Get his shirt off. Don't bother with the buttons. Just tear it. Someone ripped the front of Marcus's shirt open. His skin has to be dry. Give me a towel. A napkin was shoved into her hand, and she wiped quickly across his chest before tossing it aside. She placed the first electrode pad at an angle beneath his right collarbone, the second along his left side below the armpit, then pressed the edges firmly into place with the full surface of her palm, because she knew that if even one corner lifted, the current could travel wrong. The machine began analyzing his rhythm. Whitaker, hands off. Nobody touch him. Dean pulled his hands away from Marcus's chest as though he had touched fire. Nobody touch the floor where he's lying. Everybody step back. The housekeeper backed away 2 steps. The men followed, and for 3 seconds, the only sound in the room was the machine. Then the voice spoke again, shock advised. Clear. Nobody touch the patient. Ren swept her eyes around everyone's feet, made sure no one was still within reach, then pressed the button. Marcus Corvino's body jerked once, clean and brief, his shoulders lifting less than half an inch from the floor before dropping back down, and the dry sound of it made the housekeeper turn her face away. Compressions again. Now. Don't check anything. Just start. Dean lunged forward. No. Let me. Your rhythm is uneven. She shoved him aside with her shoulder and placed her hands back on Marcus's chest, and this time she didn't count aloud. She counted in her head because she needed her ears free to listen. 30, 2 breaths, 30, 2 breaths. She had done this enough times to know that the moment after a shock was when people made the most mistakes. Everyone wanted to stop and see whether it had worked, and that need to look stole from the heart the very 2 minutes it needed most after being restarted. So she kept compressing. 1 cycle, then another. The machine reached the next analysis, and she lifted her hands away, and in that silence no one in the room seemed to breathe. No shock was advised. Ren placed 2 fingers against the side of his neck beneath the angle of his jaw and pressed lightly. She stayed still longer than she wanted to. Then she spoke. "I have a pulse." 3 words, no louder than any of her commands, and the entire room seemed to collapse beneath them. One man dropped down onto the floor. Another turned his face toward the wall. Dean Whitaker was still kneeling there, red marks still pressed into the heels of his hands, staring down at the chest of the man in front of him as though he couldn't believe he had just watched it rise on its own. "We aren't done," Ren said immediately, cutting through the relief before it could spread. "His pulse is weak and fast. He could lose it again at any second. Nobody takes those pads off. Nobody disconnects the machine from him. Leave everything exactly where it is until the ambulance gets here." She turned his head gently to one side, one hand supporting his chin, the other resting against his collarbone, then sat back on her heels and waited, her eyes never leaving the shallow rise and fall of his chest. From far outside came the thin, high sound of a siren, growing louder as the ambulance turned onto the drive, followed by someone at the gate, shouting directions. At the same moment, the door near the guest wing flew open. Rosalind Corvino, 68 years old, barefoot, a robe thrown hastily over her shoulders, came running down the hallway at a speed none of the men in that house thought she still possessed. Someone moved to stop her at the dining room door. Dean lifted one hand in warning, and the man stepped aside. She stopped at the threshold. She looked at the overturned table. The rug dragged crooked across the floor, the 2 white pads stuck to her son's bare chest, and the wires running from them to the blinking orange case. Then she looked at his face, gray and slack, and completely unfamiliar. She didn't scream. She only lifted one hand, gripped the doorframe, and stood there. "He's alive." She wasn't asking anyone in particular. Ren looked up. "Yes. His heart is beating again. He's breathing on his own, but it's very shallow, and he hasn't regained consciousness. Will he wake up? I can't promise you that. What I could do was keep blood moving to his brain until the ambulance arrived, and I did that." Rosalind stepped forward slowly and knelt on the other side of her son. She didn't touch him because Ren had just said no one should. She only placed one hand flat on the hardwood floor about a handspan from his shoulder and left it there. Then she raised her eyes to the woman across from her, to the 2 hands still supporting her son's chin, and asked the question no one in that house had asked in 6 months. "What's your name?" Outside, the siren went silent just beyond the front steps, and the wheels of a stretcher rattled over the stone. 2 paramedics entered the room at the same time, the first pushing the stretcher, the second carrying an equipment bag, and the man behind stopped in mid-step when he saw who was kneeling on the floor. Callahan? Owen Barlow was 26 years old, and 3 years earlier he had still been a junior technician in the cardiac intensive care unit, the one who wiped down machines, changed sheets, and stood outside the circle while everyone else did the real work. Ren didn't answer to her name. She began the handoff. Male, 38 years old, witnessed cardiac arrest. Onset at approximately 3 minutes past 8. Brief seizure activity at the start, followed by loss of consciousness. Then agonal respirations, not spontaneous breathing. No carotid pulse when I reached him. Chest compression started at 4 minutes past 8. Total time without circulation under 2 minutes. Automated external defibrillator applied at 8 minutes past 8. Analysis advised shock. 1 shock delivered. Then continuous compressions for 2 cycles. Second analysis advised no shock. Carotid pulse returned, weak and rapid. Approximately 130. Currently breathing spontaneously, but shallow. Still unconscious. No response to verbal commands. Electrode pads are still in place on his chest, and I left the machine connected for you. No known allergies that I'm aware of. He's taking cardiac medication. While she spoke, Owen's partner had already cut away the rest of Marcus's shirt, attached monitoring electrodes, and neither man asked her to repeat a single word. Owen placed an oxygen mask over Marcus's face, got an intravenous line into the back of his hand on the first attempt, and called across the room, his voice shifting completely into the clipped tone of his profession. Airway is still self-protected. Blood pressure 70/40. We're going to Evanston. 11 minutes. They counted to 3. Lifted him onto the stretcher with the transfer board, secured the straps, and pulled the safety belt across his chest. Rosalind Corvino rose from the floor and followed the stretcher to the door. Ren was still kneeling there, and as they rolled Marcus past her, she added one more sentence, no louder than anything she had said before, with no emphasis on any particular word. I'm the one who sorts his medication into the weekly pill box. For the past 3 weeks, One of the pills hasn't looked like the old one. I reported it. You should run a toxicology screen, too. Owen was already giving numbers to the hospital dispatcher over the radio. His partner was pushing the stretcher across the threshold. The housekeeper was searching for Rosalind's car keys. Dean Whitaker was saying something into a phone at the corner of the hallway. The door closed. The siren faded into the distance, and that sentence remained behind on the dining room floor with the broken pieces, untouched by anyone. Wren stood up. Her knees were numb, and she had to grip the edge of a chair for a moment before she could steady herself. No one said anything to her. People began setting the table upright again, gathering shards of porcelain, rolling up the rug that had been dragged out of place, and she stood inside that rhythm of work for another 10 seconds or so before walking out through the back hallway toward the servants' quarters at the far end of the east wing. She closed the door to her room and sat down on the edge of the bed. Until then, her hands had been steady. Then they began to shake, both of them, from the wrists down, and she let them shake because she knew there was no way to stop it, and also knew it would pass within a few minutes. She sat there without moving, both hands resting palms down on her thighs, until they grew still again. Then she picked up her phone. She dialed a number she knew by heart, checking the clock before she did. 10 minutes to 9, still early enough to catch them before the night shift change. A familiar woman's voice answered on the other end. Wren asked how her mother had been that day. The woman said Mrs. Colleen had eaten about 2/3 of her dinner, had spent some time in the common room that afternoon, and hadn't had any episodes of agitation. Around noon, though, she had wandered into the hallway looking for a door and calling someone's name, but she had eventually calmed down. Wren asked whose name she had been calling. The woman said she wasn't sure, but it sounded like a man's name. Wren thanked her. Then the woman hesitated, and her voice shifted into the polite tone Wren had learned to recognize from a distance, and she said the billing office had asked her to mention the account again, that it had now entered its 3rd month, that they understood the circumstances. But facility policy required the file to be escalated after 90 days, and they hoped she could make arrangements within the next 2 weeks. Wren said she knew. She said she would take care of it. She thanked her again and ended the call, then sat for a while longer with the phone face down in her palm. On the small table beside the bed was an envelope that had already been opened, and she didn't look at it. She stood, changed out of the clothes, stained at the knees, and marked by 2 dark streaks along the sleeves, rolled them up and stuffed them into the laundry bag, then washed her hands for a long time under the faucet, working carefully into every space around her fingernails, following a habit her body carried out without asking permission from her mind. When she came back out, the door to her room was still slightly open, and Dean Whitaker was standing in the hallway. He didn't knock. He didn't step inside. He simply stood there with both hands hanging at his sides, looking at her far longer than a man like him usually allowed himself to look at anyone. Something had formed in the set of his jaw, some sentence that never managed to make it past his mouth. In the end, he gave her only the smallest nod, turned away, and walked back toward the main wing, the sound of his shoes fading slowly across the stone floor. By close to midnight, Marcus Corvino had been transferred from Evanston to Northwestern Memorial on Michigan Avenue, and by the next morning there were already 2 family men stationed at opposite ends of the 14th floor hallway. No one had asked Wren to come. She went because Rosalind, just before getting into the car, had turned back to find her in the kitchen and said only one thing, that she wanted someone there who understood the words doctors used. So that morning, Wren sat in the last row of chairs in the corridor, about 30 feet from Marcus's room, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she listened. Dr. Preston Hale arrived at 9 o'clock. He was 49 years old and came with an assistant, and he greeted Rosalind in the same warm voice Wren had heard over the phone the night before. He stood just outside the room holding a folder of papers, and he spoke to the patient's mother, but loudly enough for the entire hallway to hear. He said the scans showed a small area of injury, that this was most likely a transient ischemic stroke accompanied by seizure activity, and that the cardiac arrest the night before had been a secondary consequence rather than the underlying cause. He said the patient had passed through the most dangerous stage, and what he needed now was complete quiet, no stimulation, no visitors, and as little movement as possible. Then he made a recommendation. He said that given the family's position, allowing its head to remain in a public hospital in the middle of downtown was an unnecessary risk, that too many people had authorized access to medical records there, that all it would take was one nurse talking to one acquaintance, and the press would have the story within 24 hours, and that the family's enemies would read it before the family did. He said he could arrange to have all necessary monitoring equipment installed at the Winnetka estate within a day, with a private nurse there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that he himself would come morning and evening. He told her to think about it, but in his opinion, the sooner the better. Rosalind Corvino didn't answer immediately. She thanked him, said she needed to discuss it with her son once he was awake, and Hale nodded before walking toward the elevators with his assistant. At the far end of the hallway, Wren sat perfectly still, both hands wrapped around the cold coffee, and did what her mind had taught itself to do for the past 3 years whenever she heard a medical explanation. She rearranged the pieces. A 38-year-old man had gone into sudden cardiac arrest. The defibrillator had advised a shock, which meant his heart had entered a lethal, abnormal rhythm, and a stroke didn't create that rhythm. A stroke small enough to leave only a minor area of injury didn't collapse the circulation of an otherwise healthy man within seconds in the middle of dinner. And the doctor who had just built that entire explanation had told them the night before, without ever laying a hand on the patient, to stop chest compressions. Wren looked down at the coffee. If Marcus Corvino was taken back to the estate, he would lie in a room controlled by one person, take pills prescribed by one person, and be watched by staff who reported to one person. And when he died there, no one would see anything unusual, because the diagnosis explaining that death had already been written in advance. She set the cup down. Near noon, a nurse came out and told Rosalind that the patient was awake. She went in first. About 10 minutes later, she came back out, her face pale from lack of sleep, and searched the hallway until she found Wren. She said only, "He wants to see you." Inside the room, Marcus Corvino lay slightly elevated against the pillows, an intravenous line in the back of his hand, monitoring electrodes still attached to his chest. Some color had returned to his face. He didn't turn his head when the door opened. He only shifted his eyes toward her, and that gaze was far more alert than a man who had been in cardiac arrest 16 hours earlier had any right to be. Wren stopped 1 step from the foot of the bed. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice raw and very slow, each word pulled up from somewhere deep inside him. "What's your name?" "Wren." He repeated the name once without sound, forming it only with his lips. Then he said, "I owe you. Nothing more. No thanks. No questions. No promises." 3 words placed between them like something heavy, and Wren understood very clearly that in the world this man lived in, those words weren't courtesy. They were an entry written into a ledger. She could accept it. She could ask for anything right now and he would give it to her. And there was a part of her, the part thinking about the bill that had already entered its 3rd month, that knew exactly that. She stood still for 3 seconds. Then she shook her head. "You don't owe me." She glanced toward the door, where the shadows of 2 family men showed faintly through the frosted glass, then looked back at him. "But someone in your house owes you an explanation." She waited for him at the turn toward the elevators, and when Dean Whitaker came down the hall, she stepped out and blocked his path. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you answer." He stopped. "Before anyone touches his medication, I want the pill organizer in his bedroom sealed and sent for toxicology testing. The entire box, every compartment, and every original prescription bottle in the cabinet. Don't give it to Dr. Hale. Send it to an outside laboratory, and have one of your own people carry it there and bring the results back." Dean looked at her, and there was something different in that look from the night before, but not different in the way she had hoped. "Do you understand what you're saying?" "Yes. You're telling me the family's private doctor poisoned the boss." "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm saying the medication needs to be tested. Who's right and who's wrong is for the results to decide. Then let me tell you what I'm looking at." He lowered his voice, and it never became louder, but it tightened. "The only person in that house who touches his pillbox every week is you. The only person who knows what's inside it is you. Last night the boss went down, and the only person in the house who knew exactly what to do was also you. You clean rooms, you mop floors, you carry towels, and then while more than a dozen men are standing there frozen, you start speaking medical terminology so fast I couldn't understand half of it. Now you come to me and tell me to have the pills tested. What do you think that looks like in my head? I know exactly what it looks like. Tell me. It looks like someone poisoned the boss, panicked, saved him, then got to me first so they could clean themselves before anyone else thought of it." She said it no faster and no slower than anything else. "If I were in your position, I'd think exactly the same thing." Dean hadn't expected her to say it aloud. He went silent. "So now I'll give you the reasons." She stepped back half a pace, just enough that she wasn't speaking directly into his face. "Last night, the defibrillator analyzed his rhythm and advised a shock. It only advises a shock when the heart is in a specific kind of chaotic rhythm. The machine doesn't guess. It reads. A stroke doesn't create that rhythm. This morning, Dr. Hale stood in that hallway and told his mother it was a mild stroke with seizure activity. That doesn't match what the machine in your house recorded. Machines can be wrong. Machines can be wrong. He also told me last night to stop chest compressions while he was 20 minutes away and had never checked the patient's pulse himself. No doctor does that over the phone. They tell you to keep compressing. Better to compress when you shouldn't than fail to compress when you should. Because once a person's heart has stopped, there isn't much left to lose. He told you the opposite. You heard him say it with your own ears." Dean remembered. He remembered it clearly. He remembered even the relief he had felt when a man with credentials told him to stand still and do nothing, and he didn't like the way that relief sat in his stomach now. "And third," Wren continued, "this morning he recommended taking Marcus home, out of the hospital, out of the shared medical record, into a room where he alone writes the prescriptions. He alone monitors him, and he alone documents what happened. Your job is keeping people alive. Think about it. If you wanted to kill someone without anyone asking questions, where would be the most convenient place to put him?" The hallway stayed silent for a long moment. "If you're telling the truth," Dean said, "then why did you save him last night?" "Because that's what I do." "That isn't an answer." "It's the only answer I have." He looked at her for a long time, and he still didn't believe her. Wren could read that plainly, and she made no attempt to change it. But something else had begun running beside the suspicion in his mind, the instinct that had kept him alive for 9 years in his line of work. And it didn't care whom he trusted. It only calculated risk. If she was lying and he ordered the testing, he would lose a few $1,000s and embarrass himself in front of Dr. Hale. If she was telling the truth and he didn't order the testing, then within another week his boss would die in his own bed, and Dean would be the man standing outside that bedroom door the entire time. "Have you touched the pillbox at any point since last night?" "No. I left the dining room and went back to the servants' quarters. I haven't been upstairs." "Who's been inside the boss's bedroom since last night?" "I don't know. That's your job." Dean pulled out his phone, then slipped it back into his pocket. "I'm not promising you anything. I'll report it up the chain. The decision isn't mine. I don't need a promise. I need that box left unopened until someone comes to collect it." "And you," he said, already walking past her before finishing the sentence, without turning around. "Until we have the results, you stay on the property. You don't go anywhere." "Fine." He kept walking. Wren remained in the middle of the hallway, knowing she had just done exactly one thing right, and knowing just as clearly that she had also placed her own name at the top of a list. That afternoon, Dean came back to find her in the last row of chairs at the end of the hallway, and said the boss wanted to see her, and this time, he didn't go into the room with her. Marcus Corvino was able to sit up now, his back propped high against the pillows, and some of the wires had been removed. He motioned for the 2 men standing in the room to leave. They did. The door closed. "Sit." Wren sat down in the chair beside the bed. He let the silence remain for quite a while before speaking, and she realized it wasn't because he was weak. It was simply the way he worked. "Why does a housekeeper know how to check a pulse?" She didn't answer. "Last night you recognized a breathing pattern that 12 people in my house thought meant I was still alive. You knew where to place the electrode pads. You knew how many compressions to count and how deep to press. This morning you sat outside in the hallway listening to my doctor speak to my mother, and I'm told that afterward you went straight to Whitaker." He was still speaking very slowly, his voice still rough, but there wasn't a single wasted word. People don't learn those things anywhere except in a place where they do them every day. Wren looked down at her hands. She thought about saying it, and she thought about everything that came with saying it, and she stayed silent. Marcus watched her for exactly 3 seconds, then gave the smallest nod. "You don't have to answer. I'll find out myself." There was nothing threatening in the sentence. That was what made it heavy. He said it the way someone might speak about tomorrow's weather. "The pillbox," he continued. "Whitaker told me." "Yes. You want the medication tested." "I want more than that." He reached for the glass of water, took a small sip, and she saw his wrist tremble when he set it back down, and she saw that he knew it was trembling and he let it tremble in front of her without trying to hide it. "I want my blood. The blood they drew last night at Evanston, and the blood they drew here this morning." "How long do hospitals keep samples?" "Depends on the type. Usually anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. If someone makes a written request, they'll hold them. Then someone will make that request today." He picked up the phone from the table beside the bed, dialed a number, and the person on the other end answered before the second ring. Marcus spoke briefly, without explaining himself, without asking anyone's permission. He wanted his blood samples divided and sent to an independent laboratory out of state. Any laboratory was acceptable, as long as no one there had ever worked with Dr. Preston Hale, and no one there had ever taken money from his family. He wanted his own people to carry the samples there and bring the results back. No mail, no email. He wanted them to look for substances that weren't on his prescription list, not only the ones that were. He wanted it done within 48 hours, and he wanted no one except 3 people to know it was being done. Then he ended the call. Wren sat still. She had thought she would need to persuade someone again, another person, and she had already prepared the arguments, and they remained unused inside her head. "You believe me," she said. "No." Marcus looked directly at her. "I don't trust you. I don't trust Hale either. I simply don't see any reason why a person who spent 4 minutes doing chest compressions on me would have tried to kill me beforehand. And if there is such a reason, the test results will point to both you and him. Tests don't take sides. That's why I like them." There was a knock at the door. An older man came in without waiting to be invited, and Wren stood. He looked to be in his mid-50s, with neatly combed silver hair. And he gave her exactly one glance before dismissing her the way he might dismiss a chair. "Marcus, Gideon, now that you're awake, I'm going to say this and get it over with. The port is in chaos. 2 men in Kenosha have been calling me since last night. They heard you went down. They want to know who signs now. The person who signs is still me. Then sign back open what you shut down." The man named Gideon said it lightly, almost warmly. 3 routes, Marcus. In 18 months you shut down 3 routes. And those 3 routes were 3/4 of the family's money. People don't say it in front of you, but they talk. There are men who spent 20 years building those operations. I know there are. You know, and you shut them down anyway. Yeah, one word. Gideon stood there for another moment, then smiled. The smile of a man accustomed to receiving that answer and accustomed to swallowing it. He said he would handle Kenosha, told Marcus to get some rest, then walked out. When the door closed, Marcus didn't watch him leave. He stared at the ceiling for a while. "You heard all of that." "Yes. What do you think?" Wren considered it, then told him the truth. "I think last night I was convinced the person who wanted you dead had to be someone outside the fence." Marcus didn't answer. He only closed his eyes, and in that silence she could see clearly that the thought had already been inside his mind before she ever walked into the room. The results came back 41 hours later, sooner than the deadline he had set, and they arrived exactly the way he had ordered, in an envelope carried by one of his own men straight from the airport to the 14th floor. Marcus had been moved to a private room at the end of the hallway. He opened the envelope and read everything once before handing it to Wren without saying a word. She read slowly, turned back to the second page, then read the right-hand column again, and by the time she set the papers down, her face had changed. "There's a substance in your blood that isn't listed on any prescription you were given," she said. "It isn't heart medication. There's no reason for it to be there. By itself, in a healthy person, it usually doesn't cause anything significant. But you take cardiac medication every day, and when those 2 substances are in your bloodstream at the same time, they interact. Your heart rhythm stretches a little, then a little more, and once it reaches a certain threshold, the heart can't hold its rhythm anymore. It falls into the chaotic rhythm the defibrillator detected that night." Marcus looked at her. "Finish it. You wouldn't feel anything coming. No chest pain, no shortness of breath, no dizziness. One evening, you'd simply be sitting at dinner and your body would collapse. If your heart stopped somewhere with no one around, or with people who didn't know what to do, they'd find you on the floor of your own house the next morning." She tapped one fingertip against the report, and during an autopsy, unless someone specifically requested testing for this substance, they wouldn't look for it. It isn't part of the usual screening panel. They'd read your chart, see a 38-year-old man with a heart condition, see a note about seizure activity, and write sudden cardiac death. No one would open an investigation. How long? This wasn't one dose meant to bring you down in a single night. Wren said. This was cumulative, day after day, a little at a time, until one day it crossed the threshold. Whoever did this had been doing it for weeks. Marcus said nothing for a long time. Then he reached for the phone and called Dean in. Over the next 2 hours, the room slowly filled. Family men arrived and lined the walls, and the news moved into the hallway, then downstairs, then back to Winnetka before the sun had gone down. The boss hadn't suffered a stroke. The boss had been poisoned. And what followed that news wasn't fear. It was an old kind of eagerness, something the men in that room had grown up with. Someone said the first name before Marcus even asked. Dmitry Sokolov. They brought up the 2 North Shore routes the other side had lost the year before. They brought up Sokolov's man being stopped in Kenosha back in March. They told one another that only Sokolov's side had the patience to carry out something that took weeks. Only that side had enough money to buy someone inside the house. And when that last sentence was spoken, no one seemed to hear what they had just admitted. Someone said they needed to answer tonight, not because of Sokolov, but because if they did nothing, all 3 counties would understand that the Corvino family had sat still while its boss lay dying on the floor. Voices began piling over one another, and the air in the room grew thick. Gideon Mercer stood near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, and he didn't say a word. He only watched Marcus. Marcus Corvino lay propped against the pillows, both hands resting on the blanket, and he let them talk until they exhausted themselves. Then he lifted his eyes. The room went quiet very quickly. Which one of you was standing in my dining room Tuesday night? No one answered. None of you. He said it himself, because everyone in that room belonged to this family. He sat a little straighter, and even that small movement seemed to draw the entire room inward. The poison didn't come through the front gate. It didn't climb the fence. It didn't fly over from the North Shore. It came across my table. Every day, for weeks, inside a house with 12 armed men and a camera system I pay for every month. He let the words remain in the room. If I send you after Sokolov tonight, then whoever is standing inside my house gets another week to erase the evidence. And next week you'll have a war, a funeral, and a murderer still sitting at the same table with you. Someone started to speak. Marcus raised 2 fingers, no higher than the blanket, and the man closed his mouth. Nobody does anything, he said. Nobody calls anyone. Nobody leaves the city. From now until I say otherwise, this entire family stays still. Then he gave them the final sentence in that same level voice, never raising it even slightly, and yet the men nearest the door still felt the backs of their necks turn cold. I want to know who has sat at the same table with me for 20 years and watched me eat. He was discharged on the 6th day, and that evening, in his study at Winnetka, a file was placed on his desk that was thinner than he had expected. He had ordered it 3 days earlier, at the same time he ordered the blood samples. And he had ordered it for one very practical reason. Someone inside this house was trying to kill him, and he couldn't afford to leave anyone outside the investigation, not even the woman who had saved his life. He opened the file and began at the beginning. The first page was the background statement submitted to the domestic staffing agency. The second page contained what his people had found after going around that statement. Wren Callahan, 28 years old, Bachelor of Science in Nursing. Accepted into a new graduate nursing program in the Cardiac Intensive Care Unit, then remained in the unit after completing the program. 3 uninterrupted years of service. Critical care certification earned during her 2nd year, earlier than most of her colleagues. Her final annual evaluation, signed by the unit's head nurse, was on the next page, and Marcus read it twice. It wasn't the kind of document people wrote simply because paperwork required something to be written. The page after that was a ruling from the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, issued 3 years earlier, revoking Wren Callahan's nursing license. Attached was a summary of the case. A patient had died after receiving medication pursuant to a physician's order. The order had been signed by the attending physician, Dr. Everett Ashcroft. An internal review concluded that the nurse had carried out the order incorrectly. Extracted electronic records appeared to support that conclusion. The nurse appealed, stating that she had followed exactly what the order showed at the time she administered the medication, and that the electronic record had been altered afterward. The appeal was denied because there was no independent evidence. No one working that night shift came forward to support her account. Marcus read the name Everett Ashcroft, then read the brief note beneath it. 3 lines explaining that the doctor was the son of a family whose name was engraved on one wing of that very hospital, that the law firm representing him during the review was the same firm that had served his family for generations, and that the following year he had been promoted to a higher position. Marcus turned the page. After losing her license, Wren hadn't been able to find work in healthcare. 2 years on the night shift at a warehouse in Cicero, 6 months waiting tables, then an application to the domestic staffing agency, where the employment history section contained only 2 words: cleaning work. The final page wasn't part of the employment file. It consisted of 3 photocopied bills from a memory care facility in Norwich, all under the name Colleen Callahan, 62 years old. The first was stamped 30 days overdue, the second, 60. The third, 90, with a bold printed notice stating that the account would be transferred to collections. Beside them was a payroll statement covering the previous 6 months, paid by his own household, and the amount at the bottom of each month nearly matched the amount on the care facility bill, differing by only a few dozen dollars. Marcus Corvino sat for a long time with the file open in front of him. He had sat in this room and made decisions that would have kept most people awake for the rest of their lives, and he had still slept afterward. But that night something settled beneath his breastbone and refused to leave, and it took him a while to find the right name for it. For 6 months, this woman had walked the halls of his house, cleaned his floors, sorted his medication into the pillbox every week. She had gone to one of his men and said that one of the pills looked different from the old one, and his man had dismissed her because she was the housekeeper. Marcus had passed her more times than he could count, and had never once asked her name. She had been inside his home for 6 months, and the first person in that house to ask her name had been his mother, while he lay unconscious beneath Wren's hands. He closed the file. The next morning, he sent for her. She came in, stood in the middle of the room, and he pointed to the chair across from him. He didn't circle around the subject. He pushed the file across the desk toward her. Wren looked down. She recognized it immediately from the handwriting on the cover, and she didn't open it. Her face didn't change, but the hands resting in her lap slowly closed. "I had people look into you," Marcus said. "I'm not apologizing for that. Someone inside my house is trying to kill me, and I need to know everything about everyone who stands near my dinner table. I understand, but I read all of it," he continued, more slowly. "And what I read wasn't the record of someone careless. What I read was the record of someone who was chosen." Wren said nothing. "Everett Ashcroft." He said the name and watched her. He signed the order. He altered the record. He let you take the blame because you were the person in that room without money, without a family lawyer, without anyone standing behind you. For 3 years he's been moving upward while you've been cleaning my floors to pay for your mother's care. Marcus placed both hands flat on the desk. "I can make him lose everything in 2 days. No threats, no violence. I know who he owes. I know who underwrites his family name, and I know exactly what needs to be put in front of exactly which people so that by the day after tomorrow, no one answers when he calls. He'll lose his license, lose his position, lose the name on that hospital wall." He looked directly at her. "All you have to do is nod." Wren didn't nod. She sat still for so long that Marcus thought she was considering it, and she was, just not in the way he imagined. "You said he'd lose his license." "Yes." "His position." "Yes." "Even the name on the wall." "Within 2 days." "Then let me ask you one question." She looked up. "After those 2 days, who will the record still say killed that patient?" Marcus didn't answer. "Me," she said. "It'll still be my name in the file. The revocation order will still say I carried out a physician's order incorrectly. He loses everything, and people will say he lost it because he crossed the wrong person, and not one line in my record gets corrected. 3 years from now, if someone searches my name, they'll still see exactly what they see today. I can force them to reopen the case." "How?" she asked, without any sharpness. "By having you call someone who calls someone else. Then the board reopens my case, and they issue a decision everyone in that room knows they made, because someone told them to make it. How long do you think I could live with that?" Marcus looked at her. "You want something else." "I want that record overturned because it was wrong," she said. "Because there's evidence. Because someone comes forward and tells the truth. Because the original record is brought into the light. That's the only way what I get back will actually belong to me. If you give it to me, then it belongs to you, and you can take it away whenever you want. Anyone can. They took it out of my hands once already. I don't want there to be a second time." He said nothing. "There's something else," she continued. Right now, someone in your house is poisoning you. No one knows who. Your men are thinking about Sokolov, but sooner or later someone is going to think about me, because I'm the one who handled the pillbox, and I'm the one who happened to be there at exactly the right moment. If the doctor who destroyed me 3 years ago suddenly loses everything within 2 days, and someone traces it back to the fact that it happened after I walked into your house, what do I become in their eyes? You become the woman who traded my life for a favor. And no one will ever be able to prove otherwise, she said. Not for the rest of my life. Marcus placed both hands on the desk. What about the real reason? That is the real reason. No, he said. That's the correct reason. I asked for the real one. Ren was quiet for a moment. My job was keeping people alive, she said. I did that for 7 years, and I never chose who deserved to be saved. Someone was lying there. I did my job, and that was the end of it. That night in the dining room, I never thought about who you were. I only saw a man without a pulse. She looked down at the file between them. If I nod now, then I've used that same night to buy the destruction of another person. I'd never be able to call what I did that night by the same name again. He destroyed you. Yes, she said, and he was able to do it because he believed some people deserved protecting more than others. If I do the same thing he did, what right do I have to say he was wrong? There was a clock hanging on the wall of that study, and in the silence that followed, Ren could hear every tick. Marcus Corvino didn't move. He didn't frown, didn't interrupt, didn't offer an argument. He simply sat there looking at her, and the silence lasted long enough that she began to wonder what she had just lost. He had sat at this desk and listened to many people refuse him. Most refused because they were afraid, and he knew how to deal with fear. A few refused because they wanted more, and he knew how to deal with greed. He had no ready answer for what had just happened. He looked down at the 3 overdue bills showing from the edge of the file, then back at the woman who had just pushed away something one phone call from him could have fixed within 2 days. Finally he spoke, and he spoke very slowly. Your way takes a lot longer. Yes, it may get you nothing. It may. No one has helped you for 3 years. What makes you believe this time will be different? Nothing, she said. But last time I had no one. This time I have someone who just asked me what I want. Marcus stayed silent for one more beat. Then he nodded once, firmly. Then we do it your way, he said. No one touches Ashcroft. No one calls anyone. We do this through your route, through records, through witnesses, through court if it has to go to court. I've never done things that way before, and I don't know whether I'm any good at it. He stood and extended his hand across the desk. But I keep my word. 4 days later, at 7 o'clock in the morning, 3 vehicles from the Cook County Sheriff's Office stopped outside the Winnetka gate, and the man leading them produced a search warrant signed by a judge the night before. Investigator Hollis Ward was 45 years old, spoke in an even voice, and appeared neither impressed by the house nor afraid of it. He told Dean Whitaker that his office had received an anonymous tip, alleging that someone on the property had been poisoned, that the information matched an actual hospital admission record, and that he expected to be working there for several hours. The family's men moved aside along the hallways. No one interfered. They collected the pill organizer from the second-floor bedroom, the medication bottles from the drawer, and even the trash bags that hadn't yet been taken out from the kitchen area. They asked who was responsible for sorting the medication. 3 people gave the same name. Ren was called into the large sitting room at 9 o'clock, and she sat in the chair they indicated and answered every question one at a time, clearly, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. She said she filled the pill organizer every Sunday night. She said she took the medication from the bottles kept in the cabinet, and that those bottles were brought to the house by the private physician. She said that 3 weeks earlier she had noticed one pill in a bottle looked different from the old one, and she had reported it. Ward asked whom she had reported it to. She said she told the housekeeper, and the housekeeper told her it was the doctor's responsibility. Ward wrote that down, then asked whether anyone else had heard the conversation. She said she didn't know. Ward nodded and didn't ask anything more about it. At 11 o'clock he came back, and this time he didn't sit down. Miss Callahan, your fingerprints are all over the inside and outside of the pill organizer. I'm the one who fills it. I know. That's why I don't consider that especially meaningful evidence. He turned to another page in his notebook. This is the second-floor hallway camera. All footage from the last 3 weeks is gone. Technical staff say the recording drive failed. 3 weeks completely blank. Exactly 3 weeks. He looked at her. Only one segment survived. 1 minute and 40 seconds. 11 days ago. Close to midnight. In that footage, someone enters the boss's bedroom, opens the drawer, takes out the pill organizer, stands there for a while, then puts it back. That person is you. Ren said nothing. She remembered that night. She remembered picking up the box and looking at 2 pills in the 4th and 5th compartments and telling herself she must have been mistaken. And she remembered putting it back down without telling anyone again. She started to explain, then heard the sentence in her own head before it left her mouth, and understood exactly how it would sound. Third thing, Ward said. Your bank account. 3 weeks ago, $25,000 was transferred into it from an overseas intermediary account. Your balance before that was $412. The money is still there. None of it has been withdrawn. Ren looked up. What? You didn't know about it. I don't have $25,000. She heard her own voice, and it sounded very far away. Check again. I never. We did check, Ward said, and there was no triumph in his voice, which somehow made it worse. And we also checked the bills from the memory care facility in Norwich. 3 months overdue. Account already referred to collections. Your mother is there, correct? Ren didn't answer. Miss Callahan, I've done this long enough to know that evidence which looks too perfect often has something wrong with it, but I'm not allowed to ignore it just because it looks perfect. He closed the notebook. You were in the house. You handled the medication. The cameras go dark during exactly the period when an unknown substance appears in the victim's blood, leaving behind only one piece of footage, and that footage shows you. Money arrives in your account during the same period, and you have a debt that explains why you might need it. He read her rights to her. She stood up. She didn't ask a single question. In the hallway, as they led her through the house, no one said anything. The housekeeper stood pressed near the kitchen doorway, with her eyes lowered to the floor. 2 family men stood at the foot of the stairs, and one of them let out a quiet breath, the sound of a man who had just felt a weight lifted from his chest. At the far end of the hallway, someone murmured to the man beside him that it had been the girl all along, and the other man nodded, and suddenly everything made sense to both of them. On the 2nd floor landing, Gideon Mercer leaned against the railing with his hands clasped over his stomach and watched until she disappeared from sight. Dean Whitaker stood at the front door. He didn't step aside, and he didn't step toward her. He watched her pass him and didn't say a word. They took her down the steps, across the drive, to the car parked farthest out. Someone opened the rear door. She lowered her head, climbed inside, and sat with her cuffed hands resting in her lap, and the door closed behind her. Through the glass, the house whose floors she had cleaned for 6 months remained exactly where it was, every window lit, and not a single door opened. Gideon Mercer walked into the study before the last car had even cleared the gate, and he sat down without waiting to be invited, with the entitlement of a man who had been sitting in that room since Marcus's father was alive. It's done, he said. I know you don't want to hear it put this way, but I'm going to say it anyway. You should leave it alone. Marcus didn't answer. Think about it carefully. A former nurse whose license was revoked after she killed someone with medication, buried in debt, mother in a care facility, 3 months behind on the bills. She's been inside the house for 6 months. She's the only person who handles the pillbox. The camera puts her in your bedroom at midnight. $25,000 in her account. Gideon spread his hands. You could search all of Chicago and you wouldn't find a cleaner case than that. The police are satisfied. The prosecutors are satisfied. The people in this house are satisfied. Nobody is asking for anything more. Marcus looked at him. Exactly, he said. Nobody is asking for anything more. Gideon nodded. That's the problem. Gideon stopped. What did you say? You just read me a list, Marcus said, his voice still level. You read it too smoothly. You don't build a case that smooth in 4 days. You build it over months. She nearly killed you. Someone nearly killed me, and that someone spent weeks putting something into my body without being discovered, Marcus said. A person patient enough to do that doesn't leave fingerprints, doesn't walk into the only piece of camera footage that survives, send payment into an account under their own name and then leave every dollar sitting there untouched. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he gave a small laugh. The laugh of a man conceding some minor point in conversation. What are you going to do? I'm hiring a lawyer. Gideon thought he had misheard him. That afternoon, Vivian Locke walked into the Winnetka house. She was 47 years old, had practiced criminal law for 20 years, and before she even sat down, she told Marcus plainly that she would take the case under 3 conditions: that everything she did would be legal from beginning to end, that no one in his organization would approach any witness or investigator, and that if he violated either of those conditions, she would withdraw. Marcus agreed to all 3. In 3 generations of the Corvino family, no one had ever handled a problem by sitting down to sign a contract with a lawyer and listening while someone else set conditions for them. The detention hearing took place Monday morning. There was no bail money to pay because the state had abolished cash bail years earlier, and Marcus discovered that all the wealth he possessed couldn't buy that woman even 1 hour of freedom. What it could buy was 40 minutes of Vivian Locke standing before a judge, not making speeches, just reading numbers. She read that her client had no criminal record, had a permanent address, and had a mother receiving long-term care within the state. She read that not $1 of the $25,000 had ever been withdrawn, and that if this was payment for murder, then her client was the only killer in the history of that county who had left the entire fee sitting untouched in an account under her own name for 3 weeks. She read that her client herself had been the first person to request toxicology testing, according to the sworn statement of the victim's head of security, and that without that request, no one would even know by now that any poison had been involved. The judge released her under supervision. That afternoon, Vivian spread the case file across the dining table in the study and called Marcus and Dean in. "I'm not saying my client is innocent to make anyone in this room feel better," she said. "I'm saying there are 2 parts of this case that don't hold up. The first is the video." She pushed a sheet of paper across the table. "When a recording drive fails, it fails as a system. It doesn't erase 21 days and somehow preserve exactly 1 minute and 40 seconds containing one particular person. This wasn't equipment failure. Someone preserved exactly what they wanted us to see. The second? The money." She turned to a printed bank access log. "Miss Callahan's account is online. Over the past 4 months, she logged in a total of 9 times, always from the same phone, always between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the evening. On the day the money arrived, there was no login. None the next day either. None for the entire 3 weeks after that." She looked up. She didn't know the money was there. Whoever built this case calculated everything, except one thing. They couldn't make her log into the account for them. Marcus looked at the 2 pages for a long time. Then he told Dean that the other route had been closed off, that his men had met privately with Sokolov's people in Kenosha 2 days earlier, and that they weren't involved. Not because they were decent people, but because they had something larger happening in Indiana. And because if they had wanted Marcus dead, they wouldn't have chosen a method that required waiting for weeks inside a house that didn't belong to them. Dean nodded. "So it's someone inside the house." It was someone inside the house from the beginning. Vivian Locke tapped the tip of her pen against the employment file, the thin one Marcus had read several days earlier. "Then I have one question for both of you, and I want you to answer it completely," she said. "She was chosen to take the blame. That much is obvious. But if you want to frame someone, that person has to be inside the house first." She raised her eyes to both men. "Who brought her here?" Vivian Locke met with Wren the next morning at her office on LaSalle Street, and the first question she asked wasn't about the medication, wasn't about the cameras, but about how Wren had ended up working in that house in the first place. Wren told her. She said she had registered with a domestic staffing agency in Skokie, the kind of company that hired workers and placed them with wealthy families along the North Shore. She said she submitted her application in November, worked 2 trial shifts in 2 different homes, and then sometime in the middle of January they called her. Vivian stopped writing. "They called you?" "Yes. You didn't apply to work for the Corvino household." "I didn't even know the family name until the day I signed the contract," Wren said. "They called and said there was a full-time position in Winnetka, live-in, paying about 30% above the usual rate. I asked why they had chosen me because I knew I didn't have the strongest file there. They said the homeowner had made a specific request." "What kind of request?" "They didn't say." "I didn't ask again," she said. "My mother had just been moved into a higher-level memory care unit, and the cost had almost doubled. Someone offered me a job paying 30% more, so I took it. I didn't sit there asking why I had gotten lucky." Vivian subpoenaed the staffing agency for every record connected to personnel placements at the Winnetka address over the previous 12 months. The documents arrived 3 days later. She read all of them in a single evening, then called Marcus and told him to come to her office with Dean, adding one more thing. that she wanted Miss Callahan there as well. She didn't explain over the phone. The following afternoon, the four of them sat around the long table in the small conference room, and Vivian placed 3 sheets of paper in the center. "The first page shows this company's normal procedure," she said. "The household says it needs someone. The agency sends 3 to 5 candidates, and the household chooses. Over the past 6 years, the Corvino house hired 4 people through exactly that process." She slid the second page forward. "This is the 5th hire. No group of 3 candidates was ever submitted. A request came in first, and the name of the person to be hired was already written into the request." Wren looked down at the page. Her name appeared on the 4th line in capital letters, followed by her social security number. "Who made the request?" Marcus asked. Vivian pushed the 3rd sheet toward them. "It didn't come by email. It came by telephone, and an employee entered it into the system afterward. That employee wrote the caller's name in the notes field because internal policy requires it whenever a request isn't submitted in writing." She didn't read the name aloud. She simply left the paper lying there. Dean Whitaker leaned down and read it first, and Marcus saw his shoulders tighten. Wren didn't look at the page. She was staring at some point on the tabletop, while something inside her mind began rearranging itself, and it happened quickly, more quickly than she wanted. She thought about the day the agency called her. She thought about the words they had used. The homeowner had made a specific request. She thought about 3 entire weeks of camera footage disappearing while exactly 1 minute and 40 seconds showing her somehow remained. She thought about $25,000 sitting untouched in an account she hadn't even opened for 3 straight weeks. Then she thought about the thing she had been avoiding for days. That to construct a case this perfectly, whoever built it had to know a great deal about her beforehand. They had to know what she used to do for a living. They had to know why she lost her license. They had to know where her mother was living, and they had to know how many months behind she was on the bills. No one in that house knew any of those things. No one there had ever asked her a single question. "He wasn't looking for a housekeeper," Wren said. All 3 of them turned toward her. "He was looking for someone who already had a record." She raised her eyes, and her voice was completely calm, the kind of calm that comes when someone has just understood something too large to feel the pain of it yet. "He read my case before he ever saw my face. He found a nurse who had already been officially blamed for killing someone with medication. Her license had been revoked by the state board, all of it documented. She hadn't been able to overturn it because no one had stepped forward to testify for her. No family, no lawyer, no one behind her," she continued. "He needed someone who, once everything happened, nobody would bother looking at twice. He didn't need to build a killer from nothing. He only needed to borrow one that someone else had already built for him 3 years earlier." No one in the room spoke. "That's why the salary was 30% higher," she said. "Not because they needed someone good, because they needed to make sure I would say yes." Marcus Corvino sat perfectly still. He looked at the 3rd sheet of paper, at the name written in the notes field, and he didn't say it aloud. He had eaten dinner with that name hundreds of times. He had allowed that name to sign documents on his behalf when he didn't sign them himself. He remembered that 6 months earlier, when he said the house needed another employee, the person carrying that name had been the one who said, "Let me handle it." Then Marcus thought about what everyone in that room was already thinking, and no one had yet said aloud. If this person had spent 6 months preparing someone in advance to take the blame, then Marcus's death hadn't been an act of anger. It had been a plan conceived a very long time ago. She went to Norwich that very afternoon. She hadn't visited her mother in 19 days, 11 of them, because she hadn't been able to make herself walk into that place with an ankle monitor strapped around her leg and an attempted murder charge hanging over her head, and the other 8 because she was afraid of the very thing waiting for her there. The woman at the reception desk recognized her and said nothing about the bills. She only told Wren that Mrs. Colleen was doing well that day, that she had finished all of her breakfast that morning, and that she was sitting in the common room by the window now. Wren walked down the hallway, and she recognized the smell she had lived with throughout 7 years of working in healthcare, the smell every medical facility in the world seemed to carry. Colleen Callahan was 62 years old, sitting in an armchair beside the window with both hands resting in her lap, looking out at the lawn beyond the glass. Wren stopped 3 steps away. "Mom." The woman turned her head. She looked at her daughter, and in that second and a half, Wren had enough time to hope, because something passed across her mother's face. The faintest furrow of the brow, the expression of someone trying to pull a name from a place where that name no longer lived. Then Colleen smiled. It was a very kind, very polite smile, the sort of smile people gave a stranger who had treated them well. "Thank you, nurse," she said. "You're very kind." Wren stood still. She could hear the television clearly in the corner, someone coughing across the room, the wheels of a cart rolling through the hallway outside. She had stood in rooms where people died and kept her voice steady. She had stood before a state board and listened while they read the decision that took 7 years of her life away without shedding a single tear. She had sat in the back of a police car and hadn't asked one question. She stepped forward, pulled a small chair closer, and sat down. She took her mother's hand. It was lighter than she remembered, and it rested in hers without closing around it. "Yes," Wren said. "I'm just going to sit here for a little while." And then she cried. Without sound, without her shoulders shaking, only tears running down her face while she made no attempt to wipe them away. For 3 years she hadn't allowed herself to do this, because she knew that if she ever started, something inside her would collapse, and she wouldn't be able to get back up and go work another night shift. Colleen looked at her, and perhaps she didn't understand why this nurse was crying, but she lifted her other hand and gently patted the back of Wren's hand twice, the gesture a kind person offered to a sad stranger. Wren sat there for about 20 minutes. By the time she stepped back into the hallway, afternoon had begun to fade, and there was a man standing at the far end of the row of waiting room chairs with both hands in the pockets of his coat. Marcus Corvino had come alone. There was no car blocking the entrance, no men stationed by the doors, no envelope in his hand. He was simply standing there, and he had been standing there for quite some time. "What are you doing here?" Wren asked. Her voice was still rough. "I asked Locke for the address," he said. "If you want me to leave, I'll leave." She didn't answer. He looked toward the common room door, then back at her. "Do you want to sit down?" They sat in 2 plastic chairs in the hallway with 1 empty seat between them. He said nothing for a while. Then he spoke, slowly, as though he had arranged every sentence in advance and still found them inadequate. "3 weeks before I collapsed, you picked up a pill box and said one of the pills didn't look like the old one." Wren turned toward him. "You were right," he said. "You were the only person in my house who was right, and you said it first, and no one listened to you. I only told the housekeeper. You told the person someone in your position was allowed to tell." He looked straight ahead. "They didn't ignore you because you were wrong. They ignored you because you cleaned my floors. In that house, what someone wears decides how much their words are worth, and that rule didn't appear by itself. It exists because I allowed it to exist." He paused. "That wasn't your failure. It was mine." Wren said nothing. She had already prepared several answers in her head for a thank you, for sympathy, for a check, and none of them belonged here. "I came to tell you 2 things, he said. "First, someone used your name as the place to put the blame. I'm going to get that name back for you, and I'm going to do it the way you told me to do it. Through documents, through evidence. No one gets threatened. No one gets bought. And the second thing? Your license," he said. 3 years ago, someone signed a medication order and let you take the blame for it. That gets reopened too. The same way. The same lawyer. No shortcuts." Wren looked down at her hands. "You don't have to do the second thing," she said. "The first happened because of your house. The second has nothing to do with you." "It does," Marcus said, "because if someone had listened to you 3 years ago, then 6 months ago no one would have been able to find someone like you to choose." He stood. "I keep my word, Miss Callahan. I already told you that." Then he walked away without looking back, and Wren remained there for a long time in that hallway that smelled of antiseptic. Vivian Locke took the entire file to the Cook County State's Attorney's office on Tuesday morning, and Hollis Ward went with her, because she knew that a defense attorney walking in alone would lose 3 weeks, while a defense attorney walking in beside the investigator assigned to the case would lose 3 days. In this state, recording another person without their knowledge was illegal, even inside your own home, even when the person being recorded was planning to kill you. To record legally, you needed a court order. To get that order, you had to convince a judge there was probable cause to believe a serious crime was taking place, and that there was no other reasonable way to obtain the evidence. Vivian submitted the application at 10 o'clock that morning. Then they waited. Marcus Corvino waited 2 days, and they were the longest 2 days he had endured in the past 10 years, because throughout those 2 days he knew exactly who was walking through his house, sitting at the opposite end of his dinner table, asking after his health every morning, and he wasn't allowed to do a thing. The first night, he sat in his study until 2 o'clock in the morning with his phone lying in front of him. He knew the 3 numbers he needed to call. He knew it could all be finished before dawn and that no one would ever find anything. He remembered what that woman had said in this very room, that the man had been able to do what he did because he believed some people deserved to be protected more than others. He remembered reaching his hand across the desk to her. At 10 minutes past 2, he put the phone into the drawer, locked it, and went to bed. Thursday morning, the order was signed. At noon that day, someone from the house called Dr. Preston Hale and told him to come to Winnetka immediately, that the boss had been short of breath since the night before, that his heart was beating irregularly, and that he refused to return to the hospital. Hale arrived within 40 minutes. Marcus was lying in bed, and he didn't have to pretend very much, because 4 tubes of blood had been drawn from him that morning and his face was gray enough without any help. Hale examined him, listened to his heart, asked a few questions. Then he said exactly what Vivian had predicted he would say, that the condition was a consequence of the stroke, that the dosage of his heart medication needed to be increased, and another drug added to stabilize the rhythm, that he would personally bring the medication back that afternoon and administer it himself, and that there was absolutely no need to take the patient anywhere. He wrote the prescription right there at the bedside. When he reached the hallway, he made a phone call, and he spoke 3 sentences into the receiver before 2 investigators stepped out of the room next door. Hale didn't resist. He stood there with his briefcase in his hand, and he said nothing all the way to the car. He asked only one question, whether someone had already been sitting in the room next door before he arrived, and no one answered him. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, he started talking. He talked because his lawyer told him that the first person to open his mouth was the only person who would still have room to bargain. He told them about the first payment he had received more than a year earlier. He told them he hadn't been the one putting the substance into the pillbox, that his role had been to prepare a diagnosis in advance, so the death would already have an explanation. He told them he had been given instructions on what to do if the patient survived, and he gave them the name of the person who had paid him. Ward called Vivian Locke at 15 minutes past 6. Friday morning, every charge against Wren Callahan was dropped. She sat in a small office on the 3rd floor of the state's attorney's building while someone removed the monitoring device from her ankle, and she looked down at the mark it had pressed into her skin for the past 11 days. Hollis Ward stood in the doorway. He waited until the technician left before coming inside. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I owe you an apology." Wren looked up. "I followed procedure," he said. "But following procedure doesn't mean I was right. I looked at your record before I ever went to that house. I saw the license revocation. I saw the debt, and I walked into that house with a picture already built in my head. Then I went looking for things that fit inside it. Whoever planned this designed the entire thing around the assumption that I would do exactly that, and I did." Wren looked at him for a moment. "It wasn't you," she said. "You only did what everyone does. When people need to find someone guilty, they don't look for the person most capable of doing it. They look for the person who is easiest to believe is guilty, and that person is always the one standing lowest in the room." She stood. 3 years ago, there was another room just like that. There was a doctor in that room, and there was me. They didn't have to think very long about which one to choose. Ward had no answer. He only nodded. Wren walked out into the hallway, took the elevator down, and stepped onto the sidewalk. It was April, and the wind coming off the lake was colder than she had expected. She stood there and waited to feel relieved, and the relief did come, but it was far thinner than she had imagined, because all she had gotten back was the place she had occupied from the beginning, and no one could give her those 11 days back. She pulled her collar up around her neck and started walking toward the train station. Marcus summoned Gideon Mercer to Winnetka on Saturday morning, and the man arrived exactly on time, just as he had for 20 years. There were only 3 people in the room. Marcus sat behind the desk. Dean Whitaker stood beside the door, and Rosalind sat in the armchair near the window, which was something Gideon hadn't expected. "Dr. Hale confessed," Marcus said. Gideon sat down. He didn't ask what Hale had confessed to, didn't ask whom he had confessed to, didn't put on the surprised expression another man might have worn. He rested both hands on his thighs and looked at Marcus, and in that silence, everything between them had already been said. "You're going to ask me why?" "No," Marcus said. "I'm going to let you tell me yourself." Gideon nodded slowly. "Your father ran this family for 30 years with one thing: fear. When people are afraid, they pay on time. Nobody asks questions. Nobody sues. You don't need lawyers. There was no bitterness in his voice. He sounded almost as though he were teaching a lesson. I've been sitting in this room since you were young enough to crawl under that desk and play. I signed things for your father that he didn't want his name on. I served 14 months in prison for him in 1994. I spent 20 years building 3 routes at the port, and then I shut them down. And then you shut them down, Gideon said. In 18 months, without asking anyone a single question. I sat there listening to you talk about business licenses, trucking companies, paying taxes, Marcus. And now you sit here hiring lawyers to clear the name of a maid. He leaned forward. Your father ruled through fear. You're trading that away for a maid. Are you finished? No, he said. You think I did this for money. I have money. I did it because I gave my entire life to this family, and you were going to erase it, and I don't have enough years left to build it all over again. You go, everything goes back where it belongs. That's all there was to it. And her? Gideon shrugged, barely moving his shoulders. It had to be someone. I found a person no one would bother looking at twice once everything happened. She already had a record. I didn't invent that part. Someone else had done the work for me 3 years earlier. By the window, Rosalind Corvino closed her eyes for a moment. Marcus said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke, still in that same level voice, without raising it even slightly. You're going out through the front door. There are Cook County Sheriff's officers waiting for you there. That was when Gideon Mercer's hand went inside his jacket. He didn't get the chance to do anything. The door opened, and Dean Whitaker was already standing 1 step away, while 2 other men entered from the adjoining hallway. 3 days earlier, Dean had replaced the entire security shift with men hired after 2019, men who had never taken orders from Gideon Mercer, and Gideon had walked into the house that morning without knowing there was no longer a single person inside it who belonged to him. No shots were fired. They took the weapon from his hand, no one was hurt, and the entire thing lasted less than 4 seconds. Gideon straightened himself and adjusted the front of his jacket. Marcus didn't stand. You wanted me to do this the old way, he said. You counted on me doing it the old way. Because you taught me the old way. If I did, then next week all 3 counties would be telling the story of how Gideon Mercer almost took down the Corvino boss, and people would still be saying your name 20 years from now. Marcus lifted his eyes. You don't get that. You're going to court as a 65-year-old man who slipped poison into a pill organizer, and there'll be a 4-paragraph story buried inside the paper. And by next month, no one will remember what your name was. For the first time that entire morning, Gideon Mercer's face changed. They let him out. When the door closed, Rosalind stood and walked to her son's desk. She didn't sit. She placed one hand on his shoulder. Your father wouldn't understand what you just did, she said. He would say you were weak. He would say you brought outsiders into family business. She gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. But I understand. I lived in that house for 30 years, and I never once slept through an entire night. Then she walked out and closed the door very softly behind her. That afternoon, Vivian Locke called. She said the prosecutors had enough to charge both men, that Hale's statement matched the money trail, and that this part was essentially finished. Then she paused. But not all of it, she said. Do you remember that you promised my client 2 things? I remember. Then listen carefully, Vivian said. The first one I finished for you in 7 weeks. The second is a case that has been closed for 3 years, involving a doctor whose family name is on an entire wing of a hospital, and an electronic record the other side has had 3 years to clean up. I can't promise you anything. Her voice remained dry and matter-of-fact. I'm only telling you that the case we have left is the hard one. It took Vivian Locke 4 months to find that woman, and she found her not through court records, but through an old staffing roster the hospital had forgotten to destroy. Ruth Delaney was 61 years old, had been retired for a year, and lived in Berwyn. And when Vivian handed her a business card, she stared at it for a very long time before saying only one thing, that she had been waiting for someone to come and ask. That night, she had been the charge nurse on duty. She was the one who had read the original record before it was altered, and she was the one summoned to the 4th floor the following morning, and gently reminded that she still had 4 years to go before qualifying for full retirement benefits, that her son was in his 2nd year of college, that the matter had already been handled, and that there was no need for her to say anything at all. She hadn't said anything. For 3 years. Her testimony, placed beside the original record Vivian's team recovered from an archival server no one had thought to check, created something no lawyer representing the Ashcroft family could unravel. Dr. Everett Ashcroft had his medical license revoked by the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation and was charged with falsifying medical records. The family name engraved across the hospital's east wing was removed one morning without announcement and without anyone standing there to watch. 3 weeks later, that same agency issued another decision, less than a page long, vacating its earlier ruling and restoring Wren Callahan's nursing license, stating clearly that the original finding had been based on inaccurate records. Wren read that page 3 times in the first-floor hallway of the agency building, then folded it and held it in her hand all the way to the door. Ruth Delaney was waiting outside on the steps. The two women looked at each other, and for the first few seconds neither could say anything. Then Ruth stepped forward and embraced her, holding her tightly in the way someone does after rehearsing the same sentence in her mind for years. "I knew it wasn't your fault," she said against Wren's shoulder. "I knew from that night. I just wasn't brave enough." Wren couldn't answer. She only held on to her, and she thought about 3 years of night shifts in the Cicero warehouse, thought about 6 months of cleaning floors in Winnetka, and realized she wasn't angry with this woman at all, because she understood exactly what it cost to speak when you were the person standing at the very bottom. The following week, Marcus Corvino invited her to an old, empty 2-story building on Halstead Avenue in Englewood. He didn't hand her a check. He handed her a file. A community cardiac clinic, offering free examinations and follow-up care to people without insurance, with 6 exam rooms, a blood pressure and electrocardiogram screening area, 2 contracted physicians, and 4 nurses. The funding had already been transferred into an independent trust with its own board, and Marcus's name wasn't on that board. The word Corvino appeared nowhere in the entire file. The line for head nurse had been left blank. "I'm not buying you," he said. "They took something from you, and it wasn't your license. You just got the license back, and you got it back yourself. I didn't get it for you. What they took was the reason you existed. You've still been that same person for the past 3 years. No one simply gave you anywhere to be her. Now there is a place." Wren held the file and sat for a very long time on the steps of that empty building. 6 months later, on a March morning, the clinic opened its doors. People had begun lining up before 8 o'clock, most of them elderly, and several carried bags filled with old prescription bottles so they could ask what they were actually taking. Wren wore nursing scrubs, and the badge pinned to her chest displayed her full first and last name, along with the 3 letters of her specialty certification. Colleen Callahan was brought in at 9 o'clock. It was one of the good mornings, the kind that came only a few times each month. She sat in a chair beside the waiting room window, watching her daughter move back and forth between the rooms. And when Wren stopped beside her, Colleen looked up. "Wren," she said. That was all. Wren dropped to her knees beside the chair and buried her face against her mother's knees, and this time she held nothing back. Marcus Corvino arrived later, and he stood near the back by the entrance, waiting until the waiting room had thinned out. Then he walked over and stopped beside her. "I promised you 2 things," he said. "I've done both. Yes. Now I want to ask you for one more promise." Wren turned to look at him. Outside, people were still waiting along the sidewalk, and the March sunlight stretched long across the pavement. What remains from this story isn't about who held more power than whom. It lies in those 3 weeks before that fateful night, when a woman picked up a pillbox and said that something wasn't right, and no one listened simply because the uniform she wore belonged to someone who cleaned floors. A person's worth isn't in the title printed on a name badge, isn't in the size of a paycheck, and isn't in where they stand in a room. It lies in what they know, what they are willing to say, and what they choose to do when no one requires them to do anything at all. In life, every one of us will sometimes be the person standing lowest in the room, and sometimes we will be the person sitting at the head of the table. Remember to listen to the person everyone else overlooks, because sometimes that person is the only one telling the truth. And remember to ask the name of the person serving you, because a question that's small may be the kindest thing someone receives all day. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue hearing meaningful stories together each day. How did this story make you feel? And has there ever been a time in your own life when you weren't heard, or when you failed to hear what someone else was trying to tell you? Please leave a comment so we can hear what you carry deep in your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.